Hi. Artemis is the new flagship 6-voice polyphonic desktop synth from Dreadbox. It's got 6 analog synth voices with a few surprising twists, and 4 digital effects slots with multiple algorithms from Sine Vibes. With plenty of hands-on controls both for the synth and the effects. It also has extensive expressive control capabilities, especially if you pair it with an MPE controller. In this video, I'll take a look at both its analog and digital sections in depth, and explore its pros and cons compared to the competition. I'll also share multi-samples of it on my Patreon, so you can get a taste of playing it at home. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Dreadbox sent me Artemis. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview. Each of the 6 analog voices of Artemis has 2 variable wave shape oscillators, configured in an interesting way I'll talk about. And you can mix in either a sub-oscillator or noise into each of the 2 oscillators. The 2 oscillators are then passed with or without drive into a multi-mode 12 dB or 24 dB per octave low-pass resonant filter. Also in the analog domain are sync, VCO, FM through 0, and filter FM. You've got a stereo spread for the voices. The 6-voice stereo mix is then passed on to a resonant high-pass filter, and then that mix is passed on to the 4 effects slots, the distortion effect slot, modulation effect slot, delay effect slot, and reverbs, with multiple algorithms and effects parameters in each slot. On the modulation side, beside the cross mods, we've got 2 ADSR envelopes, VCA and one for the filter and VCO FM, 2 LFOs, which can also be used as simple attack decay envelopes, with 2 destinations for each, and a cross mod option to modulate LFO1's rate. Besides what you see on the panel, you can scroll through a preset and global settings menu. This is a detent push encoder, and these menus also include a mini mod matrix. Here are all the sources, and you can map each of these sources to up to 5 destinations on the panel. There's also MPE support to make these modulations per voice unless you point them to global parameters. Finally, for the overview, if you see a button with inverse text, it means that it does something to the fader or faders below it, and Artemis also has an arpeggiator and sequencer. In terms of build, the enclosure is thick metal, the pots feel solid, the faders have a bit of wobble, but it's not something I felt in day-to-day use. The screen is OLED, so it has great viewing angles in theory. The thing is, because it's recessed a couple of millimeters under the panel, the result is that the bottom row gets obscured if you're looking at the synth from a low angle. This can often obscure the entire bottom row, which actually gets a lot of use because it shows you parameter values. I think they do well to either show that on the top of the screen or front and center if you're not looking at any of the effect parameters instead of just showing the preset name. Of course, if you put the synth at an angle, this won't bother you. In terms of I/O, you've got 2 1/4-inch stereo outputs, unbalanced, and a headphone output, USB for MIDI only, and 5-pin MIDI in and out jacks. There's no librarian software, but you can use SysX to back up presets. Okay, let's dive in and start with the oscillators. You've got 2 main oscillators, each blending smoothly from saw through square or variable width pulse to triangle. The 1 pulse width slider controls the width for both oscillators. This knob crossfades between oscillator 2 and oscillator 1, or both. And you've got pulse width modulation for oscillator 1. Now the surprising but clever thing they've done here is to give you a single blend knob for both oscillators, but the blend is staggered in different places across the knob's travel. So initially they're both saws, then oscillator 1 turns to a square, and oscillator 2 becomes a square, and then it morphs into a triangle, then oscillator 1 morphs into a triangle. The result is a very smooth reduction in harmonics, kind of like a filter cutoff, but obviously different, which I think is an excellent performative way to control morph or blend for two oscillators. Of course, this changes as you tune the oscillators relative to each other. In what I think is a very satisfying way. Beside that, you've got sync for oscillator 2, which works best in this range, where oscillator 2 is tuned above oscillator 1. Not so much here, of course, that's the way sync works. And the pitch of oscillator 2 is also a mod destination for LFO 1, either in LFO mode or envelope mode. And then you've got through 0 FM from oscillator 2 to oscillator 1, so let's listen just to oscillator 1 in this case. And this will sound differently based on the frequency of oscillator 2 and the shape of oscillator 1, of course, and whether there's a harmonic or inharmonic relationship between the frequencies of oscillator 2 and oscillator 1. And you can modulate this with the envelope. And then finally, for the oscillator section, you've got a mixed level knob for either an additional sub-oscillator, for each of the two oscillators, by the way, or noise, again for both oscillators. So again, something unique for Artemis. Okay, let's move on to the filter section. You've got a main low-pass filter per voice, and it's got two modes, 24 dB per octave or 12 dB per octave, and it has resonance that will self-oscillate, and does also reduce the bass. However, the synth does have three pre-filter drive modes: low, medium, and high. Now initially you may think there's a relatively subtle difference between the three options, and there is when resonance is low, but as we crank up resonance, you can hear that in high mode things are grittier and more compressed, but you can still hear the bass relative to the resonance, and as you go lower, resonance sucks up all the air in the room. Let's maybe listen to this with a bit of envelope. So high, mid, low, and none. Envelopes, by the way, are snappy here, as needed. Let's take a listen to it on the 12 dB per octave mode. So there's a lot to explore here, both 12 and 24 dB modes, and the various drive modes. Like I mentioned, the filters will self-oscillate, And there's no way to turn down the oscillators entirely, but if we go to oscillator 2 and pitch it down and maybe apply a bit of high pass, then we've pretty much taken it out of the picture. Filter tracking, half and full. Tracks pretty nicely. Then you've got filter FM, which will modulate the filter based on the frequency of oscillator 2 and its shape, including with a sub-oscillator. Or with noise. And if you want, you can just modulate the filter with noise for a different character of filter FM. And then, like I mentioned, Artemis also has a high-pass filter with resonance. Now this is a global filter, it's not per voice, and there's no button to have this track the keyboard, but the keyboard is a mod source in the matrix, so you could apply key tracking that way. And I've fine-tuned this a bit and made this preset with nice formant sounds using the double resonances of both filters. Now this filter isn't polyphonic, so it'll have to pick one frequency when I play a chord, but still it works nicely. Moving on down the signal path, there's a stereo spread control, alternate left-right panning for each voice, and then audio gets sent into the 4 effects slots. Each slot has a mix control and additional parameters, typically 4 additional parameters. Let's dive in and start with the distortion effects. I'll mix it in without reverb. So there are a few distortion algorithms. Which will sound obviously very different. Wave folders and various clippers. You use gain to push the audio into the distortion, and there's just general level control. And regardless of the distortion algorithm, you've got both bit depth reduction and sample rate reduction. Let's also take a listen to a few of the wave folders. Level to taste and wave folding. Nice different characters here. And then of course, various other clipping and distortion algorithms. So that's a taste of the distortion algorithms. Then you've got modulation. Width is the stereo width of the effect. Feedback enhances resonances. And speed and depth control the LFO, creating the modulation. Let's just take a listen to these. Let's move on to the delays. I chose a different sound for that. So let's listen to the algorithms here. There's simple stereo, ping pong. They've added an option to tempo sync the delays. can see how it changes the pitch in a very musical way. Random repeater is an interesting one. It's a kind of micro looper that records and repeats small bits of the sound. Rep is the repeat count. Size is the size of the chunks. Let's maybe listen to this with an arpeggiated pattern. So those are the delays. Let's take a listen to the reverbs. Shimmer with tuning. Damping controls. Small. Like a lovely freeze. You can hear there are some artifacts when you change parameters. But overall, I think this sounds very nice. And then the last reverb type is cloud. With plenty of grains. With a large grain size. It's almost like a delay. And then as I decrease grain size, okay, so that's the signal path. Let's talk about modulation and start with the envelopes. You've got two of them, a VCA envelope, which can get clicky at short release times, which you control by pressing the VCA button, and the other envelope, which currently you can point to either the filter cutoff or the FM mod depth. If you want to control both envelopes at the same time, then just long press this button. That's pretty much it for the two envelopes. No further destinations are available as of the making of this video. However, I saw a video where Dreadbox hinted they might add the envelopes and the LFOs as sources in the mod matrix alongside these sources. Obviously, if this feature is important to you, check the release notes to see whether they've added it or not, or just hit me up in the comments section because I'll be watching this closely as well. And then further on the modulation side, you've got two LFOs. Each of the two LFOs has two destinations on the panel. LFO 1 can go either to the filter cutoff or VCO pitch, either 1, 2, or both. And then in terms of shapes, you've got the usual suspects. And envelope mode, either envelope plus or envelope minus. It's a single stage envelope, and you control the rate with the rate knob. Unless you use the fade in control, and then it becomes an attack decay or decay attack envelope, depending on whether you use envelope plus or envelope minus. And fade in works as a regular fade in when the LFO isn't in envelope mode. And then the LFOs have 4 sync modes, either free running, in which case they're in sync with each other but just free running. Then you've got a key sync mode where they'll re-trigger with each key press, in which case you get polyphonic copies of each LFO. And then there are tempo synced versions of those two. So those are the 4 sync modes. So that's LFO 1. LFO 2 points to the wave control and pulse width, like I showed you earlier. And it has a third destination, which is the frequency or the rate of LFO 1. So this is LFO 1, and now LFO 2 is modulating its rate to create various rhythmic mod sources. And these can also be tempo synced. Then beyond the basic mod connections directly on the panel, Artemis also has an entire little mod matrix hidden in its menu. You can use this with any MIDI source with Velocity, Aftertouch, CC74, and so on, but of course it fits naturally very well with MPE and the existing MPE mode. Let's take a quick look at how this works. You choose a mod source. Let's start with Aftertouch or Pressure, and I actually don't want to hear any sound unless I apply pressure. So I've turned the cutoff all the way down, then press this encoder, choose add, and then turn this knob to add either positive or negative mod depth from Aftertouch as a source. And I can now exit this menu, turn the filter all the way down. So now as I apply pressure, the filter will open up. And this works, of course, polyphonically as well. I could then go ahead and add another dimension to this. So let's say that I wanted to modulate filter FM by moving my finger back and forth. MPE slide, which is CC74. So let's go ahead and look for that as a source. Press add, choose a mod depth. Let's make it positive in this case. So now MPE slide. We'll add FM, and pressing down will open the cutoff. As previously, I could add additional destinations for slide. Let's say to add noise, again, bipolar, let's go for positive. So now slide will also add noise in addition to FM. There's no way to see which destinations you've added. You could just clear them if you wanted. And I think there's a limit of 5. You can add effects parameters as destinations as well. So let's say go for a phaser, and let's say that I wanted pressure to add phasing as well. Again, go into the menu, look for Aftertouch, which is pressure, hit add, then choose the mod effects, positive mod depth. And we now have pressure controlled phasing. However, since the effects are global and not per voice, then phasing won't work polyphonically. Okay, let's move on and talk about the arpeggiator and sequencer. You toggle between the two using this button and turn them on or off by pressing the encoder. The arpeggiator is fairly simple. Press your chord to hold it. And there are the usual suspect modes. Various clock division timings. Probabilities. And swing. And gate times. There are no octave controls here, at least not as of the current firmware, and that's it for the arpeggiator. And then Artemis also has a up to 64 step sequencer. Let's say settle for 7, why not? You can either step sequence into the sequencer. By the way, you clear it by pressing this encoder and adding rests like this. So that's a quick clear, and then just play in either notes or chords, which you can also play in live with ties, of course. And again, clear very easily by adding rests. You add a tie by pressing the encoder or just holding a note and pressing and turning. Let's clear this. Now you can't automate any synth parameters, but the sequencer does store velocity. So let's punch in different velocities. For this to work, the patch needs to be programmed to respond to velocities, otherwise we won't hear anything. We can take care of that in the menu. Either say choose amp velocity, or if we wanted also say point velocity to the filter and oscillator FM. So that's our pattern now. And then other sequencer parameters are probability, like previously, clock divisions, swing, and gate. So that's the sequencer. There are a few other interesting settings here. Play modes. Polyphonic was the default up until now. You've got Try, which uses 2 voices per key press, but you can only play up to 3 notes. Duo, as you guessed, 2 notes with 3 voices each. And then Unison, 1 note with 6 voices. And there's a simple mono too. And then there's Glide with legato modes for the glide if you want it. Vintage messes up. I think only pitch for now. We already talked about the mod matrix or mini mod matrix here. You can't see destinations, by the way, once you've assigned them here. So say if I wanted to assign Aftertouch to a whole bunch of destinations, I could. I have no idea what I just did. Let's try it. Okay. I assure you no cats were harmed in the making of this video. Anyway, you can't see where a destination is pointed to, but if you like, you can just clear all the mod depths and start over. And then besides various preset settings, you've also got a few global settings, and I think that's pretty much it. You'll want to tune the synth every now and then. This also tunes the filters, and then you've got various pickup modes for the faders and knobs. Scale works really nicely here if you don't want parameters jumping around. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Artemis. Dreadbox certainly addressed many of the shortcomings of the 6-voice nymphs. We now have plenty of hands-on controls, excellent built-in effects, and unlike many synths where the effects are often an afterthought interface-wise, here the effects get plenty of hands-on controls, and you heard them before. I think they sound excellent. Of course, as expected from Dreadbox, the analog part does too. Having such a broad range of effects shouldn't be underestimated, I think. It's not that just for the most part you don't need to connect an effects pedal to this. The effects parameters also get saved along with the presets, and to a certain extent you can also modulate effect parameters based on whatever mod sources are available in the menu. So these do truly become part of the sound you're crafting as opposed to just an external effect that you add later. Besides that, on the analog front, Dreadbox have given us a lot of meaningful controls and parameters to play with. The filter FM, the through zero FM, the way variable wave shaping is configured, the various filter drive modes, and the 2 sub-oscillators, not to mention the 2 filter modes, give us a lot of analog goodness to play with. All that is done very nicely in stereo, alongside with stereo effects. In a very compact form, there's certainly a lot to like about Artemis. However, on the cons side, probably number one is price. If you recall Dreadbox's previous 6-voice poly nymphs, my complaint there was that it was a bit shift heavy and with almost no effects, but it was priced relatively aggressively. Well, now we've got hands-on controls and effects, but the price has jumped up significantly. It's up to you whether it's worth it or not, but at that price range, there's a lot of competition. These can be analog synths like Take 5 or TO5, hybrids like Peak, and even the relatively inexpensive MiniFreak with its analog filters. Some of its analog or analog hybrid competition may have more voices or a broader range of oscillator and filter types. And if you're willing to go for an all-digital synth at a significantly lower price, there are other synths like Hydrasynth or Korg's Multipoly or others in that series with much more polyphony, modulation, sequencing, and multi-timbrality features, though of course with those extra features comes significant additional complexity as opposed to the relatively easy to understand layout of Artemis. Further cons besides price, Artemis is relatively limited on the modulation side. It's got 2 envelopes and 2 LFOs, but not many places to point them, at least as of the current firmware. They also didn't include the innovative chord mode from Nymphs. It would be great if they could add that. Then, like some other analog synths, it has a noise floor, not something too serious at about 60 dB below the peak, but still noticeable in some situations. Then beside that, there's one hardware con that bothered me a bit that can be fixed with a firmware update, oddly. That's the screen. Like I mentioned earlier, it sits below the thick top metal panel, and it's difficult to see the bottom row at an angle. That may be less important for parameter values because you can see where the knob's at, but say for things like the LFO wave shape, you really need to lean in if it's laying flat on your desk. I think regardless, it would be cool if, just like you see multiple parameters when you change the effects, you'd also see multiple parameters like here when you edit the various synth blocks. So hopefully that's something they can address. So that's it for Artemis. I'll be uploading multi-samples of it to my Patreon, where you'll also find my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful. Ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.